Well, there it is, McLaren's MCL33. I know you've all been waiting for it. I've been waiting for it. Two things that leap out of the screen at me when I first see it. Firstly, the colour. Love it. What do you think? Orange and blue. Really, really like it. I know we knew the orange was coming because there were some leaked pictures. I think it looks great. The second thing that leaps out is how bare it is in terms of sponsorship. Such a shame to see a McLaren car looking so bare. So I hope that good performances over the course of 2018 might make it a more attractive proposition to some of those really, really premium partners that McLaren are so synonymous with. Let's hope so. Anyway, the car has a lot of carryover stuff on it from last year, which we also expected. Matt Morris told us all in the week leading up to the launch that this was going to be very much an evolution, and also that they had a big update that they were all working on right now that would be due for release in Melbourne. So this launch spec car is highly unlikely to be the spec that we see racing in Melbourne. So they're already working on some major updates on some big parts, aerodynamic parts, I think, around this car. And don't forget as well, this is a car that was only signed off in terms of its engine or its power unit partner late in the day last season. The team said it put them 2 weeks behind their original schedule. I probably suspect it had more of an impact than that, than just a 2 week delay. But what it has meant is that lots of resources had to go into packaging that Renault power unit into the back of this chassis, into the back of, underneath this bodywork that would have already been on the drawing board for some months by that point. And it undoubtedly has to be called a compromise. However, when you weigh that up against the advantages of having a Renault power unit in the back of your car as opposed to the Honda, as it has been for the last few years in the back of a McLaren, I still think it was a decision that was well worth taking. Anyway, let's have a little look at it. Okay, well, from the front, a few things do leap out at us. Firstly, I would say that the nose cone and front wing assembly is reasonably unchanged, although one noticeable difference, particularly in the nose cone, is the fact that the S-duct has gone. That's something that McLaren have traditionally always had, certainly for the last few years, and it's gone. Most other teams are running an S-duct. McLaren are not at the moment. Whether that will change over the course of testing, we'll wait and see. It's not something that's not achievable to switch at some point, but at the moment they've decided that it's not bringing enough benefit to justify the drag that comes with it. The S-duct, as I've explained in other videos, sucks air in from underneath the nose, passes it through an S-shaped duct within that nose cone, and then exits somewhere along this upper surface of the nose. And when you've got the nose cone coming up at an angle, and then that angle changing for the top of the chassis, as it does, it's very easy for the flow, the boundary layer or the surface layer of airflow to detach itself from the top of the chassis as it goes over that lip at the top of the nose and onto the more horizontal surface of the chassis, and then lose contact with the chassis itself. That's bad for aerodynamicists. They want to keep the flow, the airflow, attached to the chassis, because when they can do that, they keep the speed of that airflow up, and it means that they have it under their control as opposed to it being loose and lost into the atmosphere. If it's under their control, of course, they can use it to guide it to various places around the car and use it to generate downforce. So that's the theory behind it. This car doesn't have one yet. It may be that on this particular McLaren, the angle between the nose cone and the top of the chassis is definitely a less pronounced angle than we've seen on some of the other cars, like the Red Bull, for example. And so perhaps there is less of a benefit to having an S-duct on this one. But as I say, we'll see how that develops over the coming weeks. So other than that, the front end, nose cone and front wing seem very similar. Front suspension as a concept also seems very similar. They haven't got anything trick in the way that Mercedes have done with the extended upper wishbones, a sort of small gap between upper and lower wishbones. And as I explained in the video I did yesterday of the Ferrari and the Mercedes, the thinking behind this is that if you keep the wishbones and the front suspension as low as possible, the radiator ducts as high as possible, it allows you to feed air into those radiator ducts that's coming over the top of this low front suspension. So that's the concept they've gone. Other teams have also used that thinking method as well, so nothing untoward there. The first thing that really stands out once you get past this front suspension on this particular picture is how different the side pods are. both to last year and also to some of the other cars. Certainly much smaller inlets on this year's McLaren to the one they had last year. And this is really has lots to do with the aerodynamic concept that McLaren are applying, but also to the cooling requirements of this new Renault power unit over and above the Honda power unit that the McLarens had in for the last few years. Much larger ducts last year, feeding huge radiators and cooling systems for various parts of the power unit on that Honda. These are noticeably, I mean, I would guess, and a big guess, I'd guess that's not far off half the size that it was last year as an opening. So that tells you that the Renault power unit will presumably needs a lot less airflow in it to keep it cool, meaning that the cooling package that that power unit has seems to be quite an efficient one over and above the Honda. And the benefit of doing this, of course, is having these small openings here, is that the aerodynamic performance of the car can be improved because these side pods can be smaller. These are much narrower side pods than the team had last year, with a much more aggressive and pronounced undercut underneath that opening to allow a lot of airflow to come underneath that overhang of the side pod and be fed round towards the rear of the car. All this bargeboard area, of course, is doing exactly that, directing airflow, speeding it up to get into this channel here that will pass it round towards the rear. So that's one of the major benefits, as well as any power, performance that comes with it, reliability. The packaging of a different power unit is also of a huge benefit to a team over and above its simple outright performance characteristics as well. The wing mirrors, again, a slightly different take here on the wing mirrors. As the other teams have done, they've had to push them out wide to get around the halo. But as we saw with the Ferrari yesterday, people are starting to use the mirrors, or the mirror stems at least, as an aerodynamic aid more than they have done in the past. And that's also partly to do with the introduction of the halo. You've now got to start helping the airflow around this halo and cleaning it up before it gets off towards the rear wing. The halo is a really disruptive device in aerodynamic terms, and we can't do very much about the halo itself. So we now have to start working the airflow around it and above it, and guiding it to the places we need it to be. Lots of detail around the side pods. Lots of these little fins here that are kind of vortex generators, all designed to sort of start spinning up the airflow. Some of these ones on the outboard perhaps are to help protect against this turbulent front tyre wake that I've talked about before, this messy air coming off the front tyre. Little vortices here will sort of almost create a spinning wall of air that protects these delicate areas at the back from this turbulent mix of air from off the front tyre. The other thing they do is energise and speed up this boundary layer, the surface area of airflow passing over the side pods, which is also really crucial to keep that attached to that surface of the side pod and then feed it into the back of the car where the diffuser really works it hard and get the most efficiency out of it. Lots of detail here around these barge boards, although very similar to last year. No major departure from what we've had, but I do expect this whole area here to be one of those areas that Matt Morris was talking about being under huge development. If they can bring this big aerodynamic update package to Melbourne, I think this will be certainly one of the areas that will see a lot of change happening. The other thing that stands out on this shot is the size and shape of the engine air intake above the driver's head, which you can see just from the picture how easily that differs, or how dramatically that differs from most of the other teams. It's been a really major trend over the last few years, perhaps I think led by Mercedes, to really open out this engine air intake and have split compartments or split channels down the centre of it, feeding different cooling elements of the car. You have to have, at the very least, a series of pipework and perhaps the coolers themselves mounted reasonably high up within the chassis. And of course, that's bad for centre of gravity. And even more, that is the case this year, because the halo, which is a really heavy device, of course mandatory for all teams, it's heavy, but it's also really high up. So teams are now battling against getting the centre of gravity back as low as they can have it. A lower C of G really helps the balance and the performance of the car dynamically on the track. So with the addition of the halo this year, that's become an even bigger challenge for everybody. So with McLaren going for this really small intake here, I would suggest, and of course we have no idea what's under the cover of this just yet, but I would suggest that that's being used if not entirely, certainly mostly, as the main air intake for the engine, and the coolers are all being fed from these two bigger inlets on the side pods, which hopefully means they can keep their coolers and most of their pipework much lower down within the chassis, and perhaps bringing down the overall centre of gravity. I really like the overhead shot. I think it's quite striking, particularly in these colours. It sets off the blue nicely against the orange, doesn't it? I think that works really well. But you can also see quite graphically the detail that they've gone into around this area. And again, I must stress, this is very similar to what they had last year. It's just being set off against the white floor that the car's sitting on. You really see the detail and the shapes and the structures, how much effort goes into these intricate little aerodynamic pieces around this area of the car. And that is why it's so beneficial. This area can have such an impact on the overall aerodynamic performance of other areas of the car. And as I said, this is probably one of the areas that I expect McLaren to continue developing, as they all will, but we expect this big development from McLaren ahead of Melbourne. But just look at the detail, the number of little slots, all designed to start working the airflow away from this turbulent tyre wake I talked about here, feeding it around the underside of the chassis and into this air intake, feeding it through to the floor and around to the rear of the floor where the diffuser really uses it to great effect. Some little additions. I think there are some different slots and different flaps around here. I'm not going to go into the absolute detail of those, partly because I've got no idea what half of them do, if I'm really honest. But the other reason is that, you know, we just don't know that this is what's going to be on the car when it starts running in anger. These are new and quite pronounced. These very, very long, longitudinal slots, two of them on either side, running almost the full length of the floor. Not something we've seen in any of the other cars yet. They do have the sort of tyre squirt slots, as they've become known, at the back, but much fewer than some of the other cars. These longitudinal slots, it's difficult to work out exactly what they might be doing, and the only way you can really tell is by seeing that in a wind tunnel or seeing the CFD simulations. But my guess would be that they might be trying to curve or curl the airflow over and form a sort of spinning, almost like a spinning wall of vortices along the floor, sealing the floor, if you like, the floor of the car to the floor of the racetrack. If you can do that, you can really speed up the airflow that's running underneath the car in the centre. And if you can do that, the diffuser at the back will generate a huge amount more downforce than if you've got air spilling out and being lost from the sides of here as the car goes around. Don't forget, way back when all the cars in the 70s were running something called ground effect on the car, it was essentially doing that. It was running an actual skirt rather than having to use aerodynamics to do it. It was running a carbon fibre piece that protruded down from the floor of the car and literally sealed the floor of the car to the racetrack. And the effect of that is exactly as I've just explained. It really worked the underside of the car much harder and produced a huge amount more downforce. So teams are constantly now trying to find ways to claw some of that back. We now have the thinking of how that ground effect process works, although the regulations now ban us actually fitting those physical pieces. If we can do it with lots of spinning vortices and building a kind of wall of air along the bottom there to channel the airflow through to the back, we might get some of those benefits. And I imagine that's what McLaren might be trying to do with this. The other thing to note from this is that the side pods, as I said before, much narrower, but also quite a lot further forward than some of the other teams have gone. We've seen trends with some of the teams, led by Ferrari back in 2017, where they've started to really push the side pods back with that crash structure sitting in front of it and below. McLaren haven't gone down that route. This is a slightly longer wheelbase car for McLaren than they had last year. And so I think by bringing these side pods forward, I suspect what they've done, and I haven't actually seen the measurements here, but I would guess, is that they've probably pushed the front wheel, the front axle centre line forward in terms of extending the length of the car, just to keep that distance between side pod and front tyre roughly the same. Because if it gets too close, I keep talking about this turbulent wake coming off the front tyres. If you get too close in terms of the gap in here, this turbulent wake will really start to impact on the flow that you're getting into those side pods and therefore the efficiency of your cooling. Nice and slim at the back, the Coke bottle area. When it was McLaren Honda, of course, they kept talking about this size zero concept when the whole package first came out. I think they've relinquished that to some extent, but even so, that looks really nice and neat and slim at the back there. And the other thing I spotted, and I can't see clearly enough on any of the pictures that have been released so far, looks like there's some nice detail or something a bit trick going on with the rear suspension, the upper wishbones. Sort of extension arm coming out of the upright, running parallel out to about here before the wishbone actually splits off in its two directions. And it looks like the whole thing is shrouded at the moment for aerodynamic benefit as well. So it's very difficult to know exactly what the thinking is, but I'm guessing, I mean, it's clearly all aerodynamic, and I guess the fact that you're keeping this horizontal piece here coming out of the upright or out of the inside of the wheel will perhaps help to control the airflow towards the rear wing end plates and towards the diffuser as well, rather than having too much turbulence with messy suspension components in that area as well. So it'd be interesting to see some more close-up pics of that when we get them. Still haven't seen the rear of the car, the diffuser yet, but I do know that the car is still running at a sort of a reasonably high rake angle. Somebody asked me the other day in the comment section, what do we mean by rake? We're sort of talking about the longitudinal attitude of the car, so the way the car sits in terms of its angle of attack between front and rear axle. If you look at the Red Bull, who are the people who really pioneered this concept, the front of the Red Bull sits very, very low to the tarmac, whereas the rear now sits very, very high. So the whole car is sitting at an angle. The theory behind it is that you're essentially expanding that diffuser gap, or the diffuser expansion rate at the back of the car, sucking the airflow through from the front to the rear and using it. You're essentially giving yourself a larger diffuser by doing that, but it has to be designed in as part of the overall design aerodynamic concept of the entire car. It's not something as simple as you just go and jack up the rear ride height and get the same effect. So it has to be part of your concept, your design concept from day one. Red Bull have taken that, they've run with it for year on year and are really the masters of making that work. But other teams now are just starting to really kind of catch up and get their head around how it works and work it into their design philosophy on their own cars. McLaren are one of those teams. So I like it. I like the way it looks. Not too dramatically different, as I say. But the biggest difference with this car is the one that we can't see, and it is the Renault power unit sitting underneath that bodywork that I hope, and I know lots of you guys hope as well, is going to catapult McLaren back towards the front of the grid where, you know, I would love to see them. It's obviously a team very close to my heart. I know lots of you would love to see them back up there as well. We will have to wait and see. But so far, I like it, and it's made me even more excited for the cars to really get going in anger in Barcelona on Monday.